Hey guys, I'm Simon here with Z1 Off-Road, and today we're going to be installing rock sliders on our Nissan Frontier. So the first thing we're going to do is take off our factory side steps and then we can begin our install. Now that we've got our factory side steps off, what we're going to do is install the rock sliders onto the frame, but we're going to do that without the extra support brackets. That'll make it much easier for us, and we'll have a lot less extra pieces to support and whatnot as we get everything into position. Then once we have it where we want it, we're gonna one by one go through and add our extra support brackets to the frame. So how are we gonna install the slider to begin with? We've got our M14 bolts and the shoulder sleeves. And what we're gonna do is this bolt goes through the sleeve and comes from the back side of the frame through two different holes. And then our rock slider is gonna meet on the other side and come over the shoulder, and we'll get our nut on there and torque everything down. We include the shoulder here, the sleeve here, so that essentially if you torque it too much, you won't bend your frame. But we do recommend being very careful when you're torquing that and not to over torque. So we've got our truck up on the alignment rack. We actually find that this install is done easier in your driveway since it's lower to the ground and easier to hoist up the rock sliders. But for filming purposes, we're gonna have it up in the air, and I'll show you. We're gonna put these sleeves through this hole, and then here in the back, we've got two threaded holes that our plate's gonna meet up to, and we'll bolt right there. This bracket with the flange at the bottom is gonna go through our middle hole here, so we'll just snake that right through the back, and we can leave that there. This one without the flange is gonna go through our front word hole. And we'll go right there, and then our rock slider will bolt up on the other side. So we've got our bolts poking through the frame installed into those shoulder sleeves. So now we're ready to lift the rock slider up and install it onto the frame. I'm gonna bolt through the upper hole on each of these mounting flanges. And the reason that is because we don't have a body lift on this truck. However, if we did have a body lift, we would just use the lower hole. As I lift this up, I'm gonna have a friend come through and start the two screws in the back into those threaded holes, and then place the nuts on those bolts poking through the frame. We'll snug everything up, and then we'll go back through after that and install the extra support brackets. So on the rear mounting section of the rock slider, we're gonna have two bolts that go into two threaded holes on the frame. These bolts are different from the other two bolts that will come in your kit. These have a fine thread on them and don't have a nut that goes with them. These just go straight into the frame, and they'll hold the rear section of the rock slider pinned against it. We're gonna have a threaded hole here and a threaded hole here, and these bolts will go through our rock slider and into these holes. If you have a hard time threading them in, just run a bolt or a chase through there and it'll clean those threads out. Our rock slider loosely installed onto the frame, and all we had to do was lift it up. It took two of us. It's easier with two people, but can be done with one. I've done it myself. And we just set it onto the shoulder bolts that were poking through the frame, loosely put a nut on both of those. In the rear, we started the bolts into the threaded holes and just kept those nice and loose. So now what we're gonna do is go through and add those extra support brackets now that everything's in place. Got our rock slider loosely in place. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this 90-degree straight bracket, and starting in the middle, I'm gonna take the nut back off, and then I'm gonna put the support bracket around the frame and tighten up this middle section. This will wrap all the way around the frame. We'll go ahead and put the washer nut back on. I can leave that loose for now. You'll notice that your kit came with two extra bolts, both of which have lock nuts included with them. Those are going to go through these 90-degree brackets and into our shoulder sleeve bracket that wraps around all the way around the frame. And then I'm gonna go ahead and snug up the center bolt, the larger bolt running through the frame. And while I'm doing that, I'm gonna make sure that the entire rock slider is about where I want it relative to the body. It'll have some freedom to move back and forth, up and down, and so you'll just wanna set it where you like it. So when we're setting the position of the rock slider, before we tighten the main bolts that hold it to the frame, We'll want to make sure that it's exactly where we want it, and you'll want to keep an eye on the pinch weld up here. You want to keep a gap between the slider itself and the pinch weld so that if you're bouncing off of rocks and it flexes, it'll stay away from that. To tighten these bolts up, I've got a 21mm wrench and a 19mm socket. I'll put the socket on the back side, hold the wrench on the front, and we'll tighten everything up. All right, so we've got this main bolt snugged up, not too tight. You don't want to over torque these. It doesn't take much to secure them really well. And now that we've got that snugged up, the rock slider's about in the position where we want it, I'm gonna go ahead and tighten up this 90-degree bracket that wraps around the frame. I'm gonna put a 16mm wrench on the nut on the top side and a 13mm socket on the bottom side. This one you can get nice and snug. But one of these brackets goes straight out and the other one curves forward. So the one that curves is going to go in the front here and wrap around to the cross member. And then of course the 90-degree straight bracket goes and meets up to our shoulder sleeve bracket. Right, so we've got our middle section tightened up. Now we're going to move to the front. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to take the nut and washer off, and I'm going to install the other 90-degree bracket. This one has a slight curve to it, so that one will go in the front. And before I tighten this up, I've got another bolt and washer that's going to go through this hole and up into the cross member. Tighten up the main bolt running through the frame, and then I'll come back and tighten this guy. So this, the main bolt running through the frame is snug but not tight yet. It is loose enough that I can push this bracket up flat against the cross member, and I'll go ahead and tighten up the bolt running through the cross member. So the last thing I'm going to do on this section, now that our 90-degree hook is in place and completely tight, I'm going to snug up the front bolt, making sure not to over torque it. So the last thing we're going to do for this side is install the extra support bracket in the rear. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and take out the two 10mm bolts that we have installed through those threaded holes. Place this bracket and then re-thread those bolts back in. So I'm going to thread the same bolts we just took out through the outside of this bracket, through the rock slider, and into those threaded holes on the frame. All right, so this slot right here is going to need to line up with this unthreaded hole. So I'm going to make sure it stays about right there, and then go ahead and tighten those up, keeping it pressed up against the frame. So the last thing we're going to do for this side is we're going to take our self-tapper that came with our kit, and we're going to thread it through this slot and into this unthreaded hole, and we should be good to go. You're just going to need a 14mm socket, and I find that this is easiest to do with an impact. Just make sure not to over tighten it. I'm going to keep some pressure up against this, and I'm going to hold this down, and it's going to drill through and cut our threads and bolt right up into the frame. All right, that should be good to go. We're going to go ahead and repeat that exact same process for the driver's side. The only difference is the rear bracket that wraps around the frame. Instead of going through an unthreaded hole with a self-tapper, this one's going to meet up on the gas tank support. So there will be a threaded hole, and this will just sit right on top of that, and you'll run the bolt up through. But otherwise, everything should be pretty much exactly the same. We're going to go through and repeat the exact same process that we just did for the passenger side. One of the things to watch out for, especially if you're doing this in your driveway, is your catalytic converters are going to be right here behind the front bolt sleeve that runs through the frame. So one, make sure it's not piping hot, but two, you're just going to come in at an angle and then snake in, and it should go right through the frame. Cool. All right, so now we're getting ready to put the rock slider up onto the driver's side. So we got the two front bolts loosely threaded on. And now I'm just going to pop these through the rear and get the threads started pretty well on that, and then we can let the whole thing droop. All right, so we've got our rock slider. It's very loosely dangling off the frame right now. And we're gonna repeat the exact same process that we did on the passenger side. We're gonna start with the middle section, install the extra support bracket there, the front section, and then the rear. So yeah, should be good to go. All right, so we are just about done installing the driver's side rock slider. Everything on this, on the driver's side is the same as the passenger side, except for in the rear. So what we're gonna do in the rear is take this bracket. It's gonna go up onto the frame. We're gonna take the 2 bolts that we put in earlier out, run those back through this, and then our bracket is gonna overlap onto the mounting point for your gas tank skid. So we've got our Z1 off-road gas tank skids on here, but regardless of which skid plate you have, this should work just fine. So I'm gonna take this bolt out, and then our bracket will just wrap around right on top of it. So I'm gonna make sure to start the threads on all these bolts before I tighten any of them down. So we just got done installing the rear frame support for the driver's side rock slider, and we should be all done. We'll lower the truck and take a look. All right guys, so we just got done installing our rock sliders on our Frontier. These will work on both the D41 and D40 as long as you've got the crew cab. And the install went great. We're ready to go test them out, so we're gonna go hit the trails. If you guys have any questions about our products or want any cool accessories for your Nissan Frontier, check us out at z1offroad.com or give us a call.